Okay, let's see. Hello, everyone. I'm Nikki Yeager, and I'm from ChartFlow. Today, I'm going to be doing our webinar on introducing charting to students who would like to practice healthcare in the United States. So this is a really good webinar for anyone who teaches nursing, all the way up to teaching medical school, physician's assistants, all the way down to nursing assistants. So no matter what you do, if you're going to work in healthcare in the United States, you're going to have to do charting. We have a saying here that if it's not in the chart, it didn't happen. And we teach all students that from the very first day of school all the way until they are in a hospital. I am going to be sharing my screen. Let me go ahead and do that. I'll be sharing my screen with you, and you should be able to see that. I will also be recording this, so anyone who did not get a chance to join, I will send a link to the recording afterwards, and anyone who would like can watch it. I am going to be showing you some teaching ideas within our site, ChartFlow, because that's the company I work for, but you do not need ChartFlow to use these teaching ideas. So if you have another EHR, an electronic health record, or even if you use paper charting, or if you have something like Google Sheets, a free spreadsheet program, and you make a chart on there for your students to use, you can still use these teaching ideas. So just because you're not our customer doesn't mean that you shouldn't be listening to this. You can apply these teaching ideas to anything. I'm going to open up the patient chart here for Edna Jones. And the reason we do suggest, if you can, practicing charting digitally, if your students will be working in the United States, is because almost every facility now is on electronic health records. Unless you're in a very under-resourced community, way out in a rural setting where maybe the internet isn't great, unless you're in that very specific circumstance, all of your students are going to be charting exclusively on computers. They will not be using paper charts if they're working in the United States, especially if they're in a hospital. Now, that's different if they're working in a home healthcare setting, but in hospitals, they will be using electronic charting. Okay. So the first thing that we always talk about when we're introducing the idea of charting, no matter what level a student is going to be working at, is they have to be comfortable with an EHR or a chart and what's in it. So if you look at the left-hand side of my screen, you're going to see all these different tabs. In other programs, they might be at the top, but you're going to basically see the same stuff. If I sat here and went through every one of these and explained what it was for and what to find in them, you would be so bored. I'm not going to do that to you. And I would hope that you don't do that to your students because it will be incredibly boring for them. Instead, the first time we talk about charting, what I like to do is a scavenger hunt. So that's sort of like a game where you have to find different pieces of information. Instead of walking through and talking about all of these different things, I would set up an activity that has different pieces of information you have to find. So, does this patient have any allergies? What is the last set of vital signs taken on her? What is her current temperature? Things like that that will require students to click through these different sections to find information. If a student is using their own brain and trying to find information, they're going to remember it a lot better than if you're talking at them. So for example, if I said, find information from let's say the physician who admitted this patient, they would eventually have to make their way to notes and they would see an admissions note here. So if I had a question that said something along the lines of, what type of medical history does she have, or what type of problems does she have in her medical history? You could come in here and find that she has a history of high blood pressure and pre-diabetes. So what I like to do when I make a scavenger hunt is you can assign that for homework. So if you don't have time to talk about charting in your classroom, assign it for homework, have students find the different pieces of information, bring them back on a worksheet and compare your answers. If you're doing it in class, I like to separate students into groups of 2, and they can work together to find this information. And you can give 1 point per correct answer. See who gets the most points. If you turn it into a game, it tends to be a lot more interesting than if you're just going through these different sections. So when we do that, we're going to give them an opportunity to look through all these different sections and find information. That will help acquaint them with what is in a chart. After we get students used to what is in a chart or how a chart looks, we're going to talk about some other things. In the United States, we're always going to be using English when we're charting, but using the correct medical abbreviations and terminology is very, very important. And you can see, if I click into this other website, if you go to blog.chartflow.io, this is our free blog. You don't need to log in. You don't need to have an account. We have tons of free resources on here. One of our posts is about how to practice or study medical terminology and abbreviations. If you come in here and click on the link, you'll find a matching game. You can change it so that it's flashcards or a quiz. But before you do this activity and talk about charting within the chart, you want to make sure your students know what are appropriate abbreviations to use when they are working in the medical field. So whether they're a nurse or whether they're a doctor, they still need to know how to use proper abbreviations. So they can use our free flashcards to do that if they want to, or you can use whatever resources you have now. Once they're comfortable with it, I have an activity set up in here. If you use ChartFlow, this activity is included and you can just add it to your course. What this activity is I have put mistakes in here. So abbreviations that you're not supposed to use. If you go back and look at this list, we have abbreviations that we do use, but we also have ones that you are not supposed to use in the United States because they can lead to medication or medical errors. So for example, we no longer recommend using IU for international unit because it can be mistaken for IV. We do not recommend putting trailing zeros. So if you have 10 milligrams of a medication, you should not put 10.0. You should only write 10. We don't use QD or any other variation of this for daily. You're supposed to write daily. So in this activity, what you can do, again, instead of just having your students write out different abbreviations or do a test on this, I've created an activity here that has incorrect abbreviations. We have the ones we're not supposed to use. You can do this in a classroom activity. I like to do it as a timed activity, so who can find them first? I think there's about 5 in here. Have students go through and look for the incorrect abbreviations. So right here, we see IU. It's not supposed to be that. It's supposed to say international units. We can see vital signs should be daily, not QOD. We also have a trailing zero here. We're not supposed to have that. So we can go through and try to find all of the mistakes. When a student finds them, you can have them write what it should be, is also good practice to start charting. So we can get rid of that trailing zero. We can change this to daily. So now we have it corrected in here. And so you can play for points, who can get the most points, or you can set this up however you want. You can also do it for homework. But so the first things we have is you have to know how to use a chart. You have to know how to find information, where information lives in a chart. You have to know how to use abbreviations correctly and which ones you are not supposed to use. Once we know that, we're going to move on to more advanced charting. In the United States, when we talk about charting, we don't do it as a class. It's part of every single lesson in nursing education or in medical education. So whatever you're practicing, you're also charting. Within that, it's very important to remember scope of practice. So that's something that's different in the United States than you might find in your own country. I'm going to click into a different patient's chart that has a lot of orders on it, just because this is a good example. So now I have open a patient chart for Stephanie Kaufman. She has a lot of orders on her. So if you use ChartFlow, you will have this patient and you can select her at any time to show your students or have your students chart on. But what I have in here is a lot of orders. If you do not have ChartFlow, use a free spreadsheet system and set up a bunch of orders like this. So what I like to do is orders that would be done by different levels of provider. So we would have some orders that would require a nurse, some orders that would require a nursing assistant, some things that will require a physician. And we're going to put all those different types of orders in. I like to think of orders as directions or instructions. So if you're a physician, you're putting in instructions for other people to follow. If you are a nurse, this is where you come and you check what instructions or directions have been put in for you to do that day while you're on shift. Scope of practice is so important in the United States because our patients love to sue, which sounds scary. It's really not scary. If you work in the United States in healthcare long enough, you will get sued. It's not that big of a deal. If you chart and if you remember to chart every single time, you're probably going to be fine. Most of the time, what happens is your facility will deal with that lawsuit without even really involving you. However, if you do something that you're not supposed to do, or if you forget to chart something, you can get fired or lose your license. So that's why charting is so important. That's also why scope of practice is so important. So in the United States, for example, again, if you go to blog.chartflow.io, our most recent blog post has this little flow chart that shows, in terms of medication administration, what falls within each level's scope of practice. So for example, physicians can always put orders in for a medication. Registered nurses can give almost every medication. Anyone under that usually can't give most medications unless they have special privileges or a special license, or it depends on the state. But so this is a good overview if you're unfamiliar with the scope of practice of each level of provider in the United States. You can also just Google really quickly scope of practice, different levels of providers in the United States. You'll find a more comprehensive list. But so coming back to our orders section, what I do in a chart is I will have these orders up, and this is a great thing to do just during a lecture. Go one by one, and let's talk about scope of practice. So a CBC, right? We're going to have to take blood for that. So we would ask our students, whose scope of practice does this fall under? Well, a physician would put in the order for it, put in the directions, and then typically a registered nurse would be the one drawing the blood. Sometimes ER techs are allowed to draw blood, but a nursing assistant, this would be outside of their scope of practice because they typically don't do any type of invasive procedure that deals with needles in any way, shape, or form. If we come down, we see an order for oxygen. Whose scope of practice does this fall under? Almost every type of healthcare worker can give oxygen for the most part. So your EMTs can give oxygen, ER techs can typically give oxygen, physicians, nurses, everybody for the most part can give oxygen. When you come down to something like an X-ray, this gets tricky. Whose scope of practice is this? Well, a CNA or an ER tech, if you were in the emergency room, would be the one that would prep a patient and transport them to the X-ray area. Once the patient is there, the only person operating the X-ray would be an X-ray tech. Whose scope of practice does it fall into to interpret the results? Only a physician. After that physician either makes a diagnosis based on the X-ray or puts in additional orders based on that X-ray, the nurse or lower level healthcare workers would be the one to actually follow those orders and do some sort of patient care. So this is a really good way to bring in the concept of scope of practice and to talk about some of those legal consequences. The orders is also a great place to start actually charting. So I'm going to go back to our original patient. In the real world, if you're a nurse and you're working in the United States, you might have a understaffed facility where the handoffs aren't great. No one is putting a point-by-point sheet on the table for you to follow directions of what you have to do during your shift. You're going to have to open your patient charts and you're going to have to use your critical thinking skills to determine what you need to do during your shift and what you need to do first, second, and third. So what that usually means is opening up a patient chart and looking at the orders. So we can see here there's an order for vital signs. There's also an order for lisinopril. If I go to our MAR, medication administration record, and I want to give lisinopril, we can practice doing that. In the United States, we typically, like I said, do not teach charting. Charting is a part of your life when you are becoming a nurse or any other type of healthcare worker. So if you are practicing medication administration in the skills lab or the simulation lab, you are practicing charting. You are going to get your information from the chart. You are not going to get a separate piece of paper that only has your medication information. You are viewing it here. When you actually give that medication, you need to go ahead and say that it was given. This is a big place where lawsuits come into play. Medications, if they go wrong, can cause problems. So you always need to chart exactly what you did and only after you did it. That's something you want to make sure your students understand. So after you give the medication, as soon as you can, you want to go ahead and say in the chart that you've done it. That way there's proof. No one can question what you did. So we can see that it's given right here. This is also great because after your simulation or your skills practice, you can use this to grade student work, or you can use it to debrief students on what went well or what went wrong during their simulation. All that information will be here for you. But the point is that it's not about charting in a silo. It's about charting as part of your workflow. Additionally, we had a order for vital signs every day on here. So if we go ahead and we go into our vital signs section, this is another great place to practice if you're going to be going into the United States healthcare system. Because as you probably know, we love to use our Fahrenheit for temperature, we love feet and inches for height, and we love pounds for how heavy someone is. So your students are going to need to get used to that. It may not be convenient. We may be the only ones that do it. But when you have them do vital signs, if you are prepping them for the United States, we want them to record in those units of measurement. So when they take their vital signs, they can practice doing temperatures in Fahrenheit. So they should know, you need to get them used to, if it's over 100 Fahrenheit, we may be in fever territory. This one, 97.9, is a little bit low. It's still within a normal range, but it is a little on the low side. So we might want to check if there's anything else going on there. When you come down and they are practicing height and weight, you can see the weight is in pounds. They should know that 118 is a pretty skinny person. That is not an overweight person. When you're dealing with someone who's 250, 300 pounds, we're dealing with someone who is very overweight. So they should have some relative idea of what those weights mean without having to convert them. Same with heights, we have inches here. So this is a great one. Even if you don't have a simulation lab, when you have your newbie students, they first come into your program and you need to make sure they can take blood pressure, heart rate, all of those standard vital signs. Instead of just doing that, have them also chart it. One, it's a great way to grade their work, but two, if they're going to be in the United States, they need to be used to putting in this information immediately when they're done. Charting is a huge part of their job. And like we always say, if it's not in the chart, it didn't happen. So those are a few ideas of how you can incorporate charting without just talking about charting. We have scavenger hunts as a way to find information and get used to an electronic health record. We have your medical abbreviations. You can put tricks in there and see if your students can find them. We have your orders section, which is a great place to practice understanding scope of practice, who can do what within the United States healthcare system. And then we also have orders as a driver for a simulation lab or a skills lab. And when they go ahead and do their charting, they would just do their charting as they do their skills or their simulation, because charting is a part of life. Okay, so I think that's the basics. Does anyone have any questions? You can put them in the chat if you have any questions about what I've talked about, or any questions in general about charting in the United States healthcare system or scope of practice in the United States. Go ahead and chat anything that you would like. Okay. I'll wait a few minutes just to see if anything is added in the chat questions wise. But just so you know, anyone who registered, you will get a follow-up email that has links to our blog with those free teaching ideas that I mentioned, including the flashcards for medical terminology and abbreviations, as well as that little flow chart of who can do what in terms of medication administration. If you have any questions or you would like to use our product, you can contact us. Our website is chartflow.io, or you can email hello@chartflow.io and someone can get back to you. This recording will also be on YouTube, so you can share it with anyone you'd like to, or if you joined like halfway through or later into the webinar, you'll also be able to watch the entire thing on there. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat. Unless anything pops up in the next few seconds, I'm gonna go ahead and end this for today. But thank you so much for joining, and I hope I answered everybody's questions and gave you some good teaching ideas. Okay, thank you so much. Have a good day.